So are we on the road to hell? It's 4 years since the financial fiesta came to a shuddering halt and a credit crunch ensued. Bailouts, rescue packages and austerity drives have followed. But are we now heading for yet another global financial crisis? The markets certainly seem to fear so. From London to Tokyo to Wall Street, shares are in freefall. Investors in the bond markets, now those are the people who lend money to governments, are becoming increasingly wary of lending to countries like Spain and Italy, which are already massively in debt because they are just not sure they're going to get their money back. And if those governments don't repay their debts, then the investors, which include banks, could get sucked into a crisis too. It is that, plus the anemic growth in the world's biggest economy, the USA, which is also, of course, saddled by huge debt, which has really spooked investors in the stock markets. They're frightened that another recession is looming, which will hurt the companies they've invested in. So what is to be done if it all goes pear-shaped yet again? Do we step in to bail out governments and banks, or this time do we let them default and go down? Let's speak to Jonathan Davis, economist and wealth manager, and Richard Murphy, director of Tax Research UK, who were both wondering for very different reasons if we were going to come to this, and indeed we have. And Jonathan, you think this is like the Great Depression where it happened twice?
We're in a depression, Jeremy. That's what your listeners need to get to grips with. It started with the credit crunch, which is inevitable because the vast mountain of debt that society, government, households have taken on is simply weighing down. You cannot grow an economy when you've got that level of debt behind you. And the policies that the governments are undertaking, bailing out those failed banks and failed industries, sucking the taxpayer to bail out their friends in the city, well, it doesn't work. It's been tried time and time again throughout history. In fact, in recent history, in Japan, it's happening still right now. 23 years, they're in depression, they're doing the exact same things as us, and yet we're not watching what is going on just on the planet right now.
So to be clear, you believe this is caused by governments racking up too much debt, overspending against the amount of tax that they were taking. Is that right?
In essence, I'll go with that, yes.
Okay. Richard Murphy, you thought this was coming, but you don't believe that's the cause of it?
No, of course it isn't the cause for it. I mean, look, there are some governments who have clearly overspent, and Greece was utterly irresponsible. Let's not beat around the bush. But that's not the real problem. We have got and have had over many years a banking system that has been out of control, which has been accumulating cash, using it for speculation, denying that resource to governments who've lived in fear of this feral cash, this wild, out-of-control money that has been used to attack governments. And the result is that we have a massive imbalance. And every time it goes wrong, every time the banks get to this point where they're at threat of failing, they turn to the government and say, and now it's your job to bail us out again.
But this is not what's happening now. This is not a bank bailout we're talking about now, is it?
Hang on. If Italy and Spain do fail to repay their debt, then the bank's balance sheets go insolvent, and we'll be talking about bank bailouts again. We weren't talking about bank bailouts in August 2007. A month later, we began to do them. That is what is on the horizon. We have to be aware of it. We have to plan for it, and that is the risk of this situation. It could very easily run to that if we aren't careful.
Jonathan, this is bankers.
The bank bailouts. That's the problem. It's all very well talking about the governments, but they're in cahoots with the banks. The banks and the governments work together to increase borrowings year after year after year, and the banks have made reckless loans, knowing full well that they weren't going to be repaid, to households, to businesses and to governments, and the governments let them away with it. They're in cahoots. We should not have bailed them out a couple of years ago in the first place. Those people who say that they saved the world, nothing could be further from the truth. What they did, and it's self-evident, just look at the headlines, what they did was compound an already massive problem. That's why we are now in depression.
Okay.
People need to get real.
Should we then, moving on to stage 2 of this, should we then welcome the idea that Portugal and Greece and Ireland, and then also maybe even we're talking today about Spain and Italy, default? And then we flush the whole thing, Richard Murphy?
Look, I mean, I'm sorry, but Jonathan sounded slightly out of control there, and I think that he is out of control there. He's imagining some giant conspiracy theory. That doesn't exist. Let's live in the real world. If he had his way, what would happen is this, and it's very simple: banks would fail. That would mean that listeners to this program would go to a cash point machine, put their card in, nothing would come out. They would go to pay for their groceries, and they couldn't. What's more, their grocer couldn't pay their suppliers because there'd be no functioning bank system. That's what Jonathan is asking for. Now, that is not just plain irresponsible, that is absolutely reckless, because he'd bring the world economy down overnight. We can't do that. But there is a fundamental flaw in banking, and that is that those people who are doing the speculation, who have been trading against governments trying to bring their currencies down, are the same people who are actually putting the cash in our cash point machines. Yes, government now has to stand up and say, this was wrong, this was an error. It's an error that started in 1980 with Margaret Thatcher. Let's look at where the problem started. She liberated the bank. She did something called the Big Bang. She freed the City of London from much regulation. She made it far too commercial. She let it become this feral economy, this wild, speculative world. We now have to bring it back under control. I agree. We do need less borrowing. I agree. But the only agent that can do that is government.
Okay, thank you very much.
Intervening to make sure we are safe and can buy our groceries next weekend.
Thank you very much. Both of you agreeing very much on the seriousness of this, but disagreeing on what's gone wrong. Richard Murphy, Director of Tax Research UK, they're arguing the banks went crazy, and Jonathan Davis saying, well, actually, it's governments that have been overspending, financed by the banks, and that's where we are. And where we are is that certain governments have got debt that they look as if they can never repay, and if they suddenly wake up and decide to say they'll never repay it, the banks go down here as well. That's the biggest fear.